How are you? And thanks for clicking into this video. This is, as you will know, because you clicked into it, how to even begin to write a book. Now, I know from speaking to a number of you over social media in the past few weeks that you're at that stage in life where you finally feel as if you want to write that book, the one you've threatened yourself to write all these years. Now, you might already have an idea in your head, or maybe you don't have an idea, but you know, or you think you will have the skill set to write a novel. So this is really just a blanket throw over of the very simple steps that you need to take in order to finally start writing that book. Now, I'm not going to go into fine detail on each of these hints and tips that I'm going to give you. I'll be going into finer detail on those in further videos. But this is just the very basics of how you would go about writing a book. So why don't we just get straight down to it? Okay, at the risk of sounding very basic, I am going to really start at step number one. So if you've tuned in to understand how to even begin to write a novel, let's start at the very beginning. So tip number one, or step number one in trying to write that first novel is, you've got to come up with an idea for that book. Now, there are tons of ways of coming up with ideas, and I imagine a lot of you probably already have an idea in your head, which is what stokes that ambition to write a book, because you know that this idea can be really good on paper. But just in case you don't have one, or in case you fancy coming up with ideas in the future for further books or further concepts, there are different ways of coming up with ideas for novels. Now, it depends on the genre you want to write in, but I very much recommend reading in the genre that you read in, or even watching TV series or movies that align themselves to the genre you want to write in. So for example, if you want to be a crime thriller writer, I recommend watching as many crime thriller documentaries or TV series and movies as you possibly can, and certainly reading in that genre, because this sparks ideas for you. So you might be watching a TV series and think, oh, I thought this character was going to go this way, or I thought this plot point was going to follow this road. You will find your cogs are constantly turning, and you think, oh, what if this happened? So suddenly you're starting to, open your mind and let your imagination roam, which is what you really want to do if you want to be an ideas person and coming up with creative writing on a regular basis. So watching the genre, or listening to the genre, or reading the genre that you want to write in is definitely one big tip. Now, you may, if you want to be a particularly vivid writer, or somebody who writes raw emotion and real stuff as opposed to fantasy stuff, so you might take characters that you know. So people that you know, you might think would be an interesting character for a book, somebody people might be interested in reading about. So very often real life characters stem ideas for stories. So don't rule that possibility out either. Even if you walk down to your local high street or supermarket or whatever it is, your local village, and you can observe people and start to come up with concepts for them. So, ideas for books can start with characters, and then you can allow it to grow. And it can certainly start with movies and books and TV series in your genre, and let them grow from there. And I do recommend writing down the idea. Now, I do this in bullet points, but some people tend to put a cloud around their idea and then, spark off different points that come from that idea initially, which is recommended too. But I do suggest that you write down the idea once it comes to you, and then even just something as simple as bullet points will help you. But another tip that I want to give you is, whatever genre you want to write in, when it comes to ideas, do look at what's selling at the moment, especially if you are an author who's doesn't just want to be in it for a hobby, but you actually fancy being a bit commercial, you fancy selling your books to publishers and getting it out there. Do look at what's selling at the moment, because agents and publishers, when you do, and I know we're a long way away from getting to that point, but they will look for something that is a proven seller before. So you might align yourself with different books that are selling at the moment. You might look at the charts and see what's a hot topic, and then ideas might spark from that, because that's one surefire way to interest a publisher, is if you can compare it to a book that's already sold well. So there's a few different ideas with coming up for books, but it is step number one that if you want to write a book, it goes without saying, you need to have an idea. Alright, so step number two in how to finally begin to write that novel is show, not tell. Now I'm starting to get into the crux of how you actually write a novel here with this particular step. So we've moved on from you've come up with a story idea, but how do I even write it? Well, you write by showing, not telling. It's the essence of what creative writing is, and I'll explain it for you now. So it is quite a basic technique, but essentially what creative writing is your ability to not tell a story, which anyone can tell a story, because we can all sit around the campfire or sit in our living rooms and tell our parents a story or tell our friends a story. That's simple, we can all do that. But the art form of creative writing or writing a novel is showing, not telling a story, okay? And essentially what that is showing is describing for your reader, so painting an image in your reader's mind. So you're not telling them anything explicit, you are showing through description. So just as a quick example, say your character's name was John, you don't want to write John was angry, because that's just telling. So you might write something like John clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, then he slammed that fist onto the top of the desk. So you're showing that John is angry, you're not just telling your reader explicitly that John is angry, because that's boring and it's bland and it's telling a story, it's not being creative. So if you wanted to, as an example, begin your novel with Barbara as a character sitting in her office, I don't want you to write Barbara was sitting in her office, which is just a blatant tell. You will describe her sitting in that office. So you might describe, the leather chair or the oak desk, or some of the features of the office, the fax machine and the telephone and the laptop or the computer. But here's the thing, showing, not telling, is the real skill set of creative writing, but it is finding a sweet spot amongst two extremes. And one extreme is telling, you don't want to just say Barbara was sitting in an office, and the other extreme is over describing Barbara's office, being too fussy or overacting, as I call it, but we'll get to that in a later video. So what you want to do as a great creative writer is find a sweet spot in the middle of telling and being over descriptive and just giving your reader enough to build the image in their mind. So that's essentially what show, not tell is. It's finding that sweet spot that you can describe and paint images in your reader's mind. So you don't want to tell, you want to show through description, but you also don't want to over describe. So it's a matter of finding your skill set, finding your balance, and essentially those writers who find the perfect balance between telling and being over descriptive, they're the ones who are selling books. So it's a matter of practicing that skill set. And I urge you to practice even today if you want. And it's simple as this. You can write down a few emotions that somebody is feeling. So let's start with John is angry, and then move on to Sinead is crying, or then perhaps move on to Bobby is frightened. So there's just 3 ideas, and I would like you or invite you to rewrite those so they're show, not tell. And it's just a very basic practice run that you can give yourself to find out how you can show without being too descriptive, but also how you can show without being explicit and telling. So just start off as a very basic bit of homework on how you can show, not tell, when it comes to some emotions. It's a good tip. So actually after that we'll move on to step number 3, which is creating characters. Now there's numerous ways that you can create characters, but first of all, if you have done step number 1, which is conceiving the idea for your story, well then you might already know what type of characters you want to fit into that particular novel. So if you've conceived an idea of this great romantic novel that you would like to write, well then you might start to think of the 2 lead characters that fall in love. Or if you're writing a crime thriller, you might already have the nasty villain or perhaps the hero cop already in your mind. But one way of doing this and creating characters is the way I do it, which is I sit inside a coffee shop and I observe people going by me and think, that guy looks interesting, or oh, that woman looks interesting, and then I start to give them a name and give them character traits. And I do write character profiles. Now I don't recommend that everybody has to write character profiles. In fact, a lot of my students don't like doing them, and I say if you don't want to do them, you don't have to do them. But I think it's essential that you have a very good grasp of who your character is. So some people find it very easy coming up with names, other people find that bit quite difficult. I've never quite worked out why people find that difficult, but coming up with a name and then coming up with some essential values that character might have. So I ask things like, what does my character look like? So you may have already observed them, so you know what they look like. or maybe you want to conceive the idea for your character in your head straight away. So the first question is, I ask myself, is what does the character look like? Then I begin to write down their appearance. Then I ask, how old is my character? I write down the name or the age. And then I would ask, where does my character live? And I come up with this idea of what their house would look like, and where exactly they live. Now, all of my novels are set in Dublin, and I know Dublin really well, so I can always think, oh, this character would live in Foxrock, or perhaps this character would live in Inchicore or Ballyfermot or whatever, in specific areas. But if you're creating a fantasy novel in a world that doesn't exist, that you don't really know until you create it, well, then you might just describe their house or whether they live in rural or urban area. Something else you might ask your character, or you should ask your character, who do they live with? So they might be married, or are they young and they have parents, or do they have siblings, or do they live with, just some college mates that they happen to be going to university with or whatever. So who do they live with is also a good question to ask yourself. And then essentially the most important question that you'll want to ask is, what is his or her backstory? So you might begin to write, something that has led your character up to the point of the beginning of your novel. So I know that sounds an awful lot, that you have to ask these questions and perhaps write them down, but some people don't feel the need to write everything down or be note takers. So you might just create a character in your head, ask those questions into your mind until you get very familiar with your character, and then you can perhaps sit down and write a full profile of them all together. But coming up with characters is definitely the next step, because it's very difficult for you to begin that novel and then try to create your characters as you go, because it's a real flaw that some people make, actually, and you can see that in flawed amateur manuscripts. So create your characters before you even begin. Remember, you've come up with the idea, you've been practicing your show not tell, your ability to write, your ability to refine your skill set. Then I want you to start thinking of characters. Who fits the idea that you've come up for your story? That's step number 3. Step number 4 to even begin to write your novel is, and this is the exciting bit because this is getting particularly creative, is pick your narrative style and pick your tense. Now, the reason I say that this is getting to the nub of the creative part of writing a novel is because you might have come up with the idea already of what story you want to tell, but the real creative part of it is, how do you tell that story? Okay, so what you need to do is pick a narrative style, and I'll just go through these very quickly, which is there's only 3 really basic ones that we will discuss for today's basic classes. And in fact, I go into finer detail on these in further videos, and you can check out my website, theopenauthor.com, for much more information in these specific areas. But there's 3 ways you can tell your story in terms of narrative style. So there is first person, where you are writing I, so you are telling the story as the author. So you're using I went to the shops, or I was sitting in my office. Whatever it is, if it's first person, you're using I predominantly because it's you that's telling the story. Another option is to use third person, and most fiction books are written in third person, although we are seeing rapidly a change in different narrative styles used in the same book, and I'll discuss that in a minute with you actually. But writing in third person is saying he or she or they. So he went to the shops, he was sitting in his office, she went to the shops, she was sitting in an office. You are telling the story on behalf of somebody else as the author. So it's not you in the story, you're writing about somebody else. That's essentially what third person narrative is. Or there is another option, which is omniscient. So that is you being the writer, you know everything about this story. So for example, great books such as Harry Potter, all the Harry Potters are written omniscient. So it's J.K. Rowling telling the story, and she knows everything that's happened. She knows everything about every character and what's going to happen, and she's omniscient. She's all-knowing. That's what omniscient means, all-knowing. So the thing is, why this is particularly as creative is because you've probably come up now with the idea for your story, and when you come up with your characters, you're going to decide, how am I going to tell this story? So I've come up with the character of Jacob. Should I tell it through his eyes? Will I use first person using Jacob? Or, maybe I want to write this in third person because there's just too much going on. It'll be too complicated, or I'm limiting myself if I just write from Jacob's point of view. But here's the thing. and this is why contemporary fiction writing is getting particularly interesting, is because so many writers are writing in different forms in the same story. So bear with me for a second. If you're writing a crime thriller and you have your protagonist, you have your hero, cop or detective, and you also have your villain, and you know what's going to happen in this story because you come up with the idea, but you might take a seat back and think, you know what, I think I'm going to tell the story from the detective's point of view. So you're writing it from his or her first person. But when it comes to the villain, you might, in different chapters, you use omniscient or third person. So you can mess around with the different narrations and how you can tell your story. So don't be afraid to think that, if I choose third person, I have to stick with it all the way through. Chopping and changing different narrative styles is what's really hot right now in terms of fiction right now, and it's not going away anytime soon. It's not going to revert back to just one way of telling a story. So it will evolve in this way. So for example, my debut novel, Midday, it was the same story of a 5-hour period over one morning, and I had 4 characters, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to tell the whole story in first person for each of the 4 of them. So they're seeing the same 5 hours, the same things happen, but you're seeing a different account of those 5 hours through the 4 different eyes. In my second novel, in my follow-up novel, She Said, Three Said, that had omniscient going through it. So all the jury chapters were reading omniscient, so they were all knowing. And then I also flashed backwards to my 4 main characters who were involved in the trial that the jury are examining, and that was told in first person through each of their 4 eyes. So you can mess around with it, but it's the real creativity of creative writing is finding out how you can tell your story. So finding your point of view, your narrative style is essential. So there is more information on my website, or I'm going to go into more detail in this specifically in a further video, so do check that out when it drops. It won't be too long till that comes through on YouTube. So do check that out. And also, when you have figured out your narrative style, there's one more key element. You need to figure out what tense you're going to tell your story in. So one of the biggest mistakes amateur writers make when they're starting out for the first time is they mix their tenses up. So they might start in present tense and then suddenly you find they're dropping into past tense. It's essential that once you've come up with each of your narrative styles, you may be using just one narrative style, or maybe you're going to use 2 or 3 in order to tell your story. It's essential that for each narrative style that you pick, you understand exactly, you nail down what tense you're going to write each of them in. So you might want to write in present tense or past tense. You're talking about a different level. If you're talking about future tense, nobody really writes in future tense. But you decide that you're writing in past or present, and then you stick with it through that narrative style. So the next step is picking out your narrative style and picking out your tense and then sticking with them. And then we move on to another step after that, which is plotting and planning. The thing here is, I could line up 100 published authors in front of me right now, and I could ask them all the same question. How do you plot and plan? And I guarantee it that each of them will have a different answer for me, because it's so unique. It's a bit like a fingerprint how people plot and plan their novels. It really is. So no 2 authors are the same. I am a meticulous planner, so I do so much research on the novel before I even begin to write, and then I write out a list of bullet points where I would like each chapter to go. So I would already have figured out, I'm not saying this is what you have to do, I'm just saying this is how I approach it. I figure out that, this novel is going to need 62 chapters, and I will therefore have a point or a bullet point for each of those 62 chapters. Now my first novel did have 62 chapters. My second novel had 12 because I was taking a different approach and there was much more in each chapter. So for those I had bullet points for each 12, but it was a bit more intricate. I had a bit more than just one bullet point. But that's not to say that you have to know everything and you have to have all your plotting and planning done before you even begin, because there is, as people will tell you in the industry, in the creative writing industry, there are what's known as 2 particular approaches to writing a book, and one is called plotting and one is called pantsing, and I'll describe what they are now. Plotting is what I do, which is, I said, writing as many bullet points to understand where you are going in your story, so I meticulously plot and plan. And another is called pantsing, which I mentioned, and that derives from the saying, flying by the seat of your pants. So it's people who just begin a novel and just let it go where it takes them. Now, I don't recommend that you pants. Now, you can pants. You can just start writing and let it go where it takes you. If you're a particularly skilled novel or a particularly experienced novelist, it's quite an exciting journey to take for those who understand that they will finish their novel. But because 99% of manuscripts go unfinished, and that's a sad statistic, unfortunately, so many people begin to write a novel but never finish it, it's because they're trying to pants their way through it. They're trying to, think of what comes next as they come to it, and then that will bog you down, and you might lose interest in writing it. So I'm not suggesting that you have to be a meticulous plotter or planner and that you have to have the amount of bullet points that I have written down before I even begin my novel, but I'm just going to give you one quick tip that I want you to adhere to, and that is, at least know your ending, because it will give you direction and it will help you eventually reach that ending. So you won't be part of the statistic that 99% of novels aren't finished. So if you know your ending, it gives you drive and it gives you direction, and that's essential, especially for a first-time writer. So I'm not saying you have to plot everything, and I'm not saying you have to plan your whole plot out before you begin to writing, but I do ask you to at least note down two things, and that's one, where your novel begins, and two, where your novel ends, because it will give you that direction. So there are numerous different ways you can plot and plan. I'm going to go into more detail in that in a further video, but as a very basic tip, I want you to know what your beginning is and definitely know what your ending is, because it will really help you. Now, the next step is, if you want to begin to write a novel, is write a novel. Now, I know that sounds a bit stupid and a bit ridiculous, and perhaps I sound like a fucking idiot, but here's the thing is, and you're one of these people, I know you are. So many people have an idea for a book in their head, but they never write a single fucking word. And that's just it, it just stays in their head forever. So essentially, if you want to write a novel, it's write that novel. So the tip here is to find time within your working week or within any given week that you can sit down at your laptop or your computer or your typewriter if you're old school, and finally start to at least even practice some of those show not tell techniques that I mentioned earlier on in this video. So you're never going to write a book if you don't write a book. It's that simple. So I know these are some stepping stones that will help you write your novel or get that idea out of your head and onto paper, but this video isn't going to help you finally write a book. It's just going to give you some structure into how you can even begin the process of it. So I do want you to go back over the ideas listed here. So the first one was to come up with your idea, and then I gave you some hints and tips on how you can begin to even start to creatively write. Just practice those show not tell techniques. They will work for you, and then check out my further videos on that specifically to get your skill set down. Then I want you to come up with characters, and then, as I said, you're going to begin to pick your narrative style and what tense you're going to write in, and then you begin to understand how you're going to tell the story. And then I want you to plot and plan as much or as little as you think you're going to need, but I want you to come up with the ending of that book before you begin to write it. And then I want you to sit down and at least even begin to start writing. So you might come up with the opening of your novel. You might figure out where your character is in their headspace or where they are literally standing, and begin to use the technique show not tell that I've mentioned here. Now, this will be just practice for you. You're not going to sit down after watching this video and think, yeah, I'm going to fucking do this, I'm going to write a book now. It's just basic, very basic stepping stones that you have to go through in order to even begin to write it. So I hope this has helped in some way. What I would ask you to do is, if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe below so you can get updated with all the videos that I release on a weekly basis. And don't be afraid to comment. So if you have any other hints or tips that you would like to share with us, detail them below and I'll get back to you and let you know what I feel on those tips. So thanks for logging into this video. I hope it helps in some way. We will be going into more finer detail on how you can finally write that book in future videos. So until then, I see you.